I think that the history of Treme doesn't really focus on the resilience of the people because truthfully, historically, the resilience of Black people has never been a focus of history. For the most part, the people of Treme have not been telling their own story. Other people have been telling their own story. So one thing that I'm adamant about doing is actually telling the story. But Treme has had a very painful history, and I think in order to redevelop properly and get past it, people do need to understand the history. My name is Amy Frances Stelley. I am an urbanist. I'm an architectural designer and an artist and a planner. Well, growing up in Treme was always fun because there was always something going on, and to this day it has remained a very, very, very active community. Treme is a place where people have very deep roots and we all know one another. We go to neighborhood schools and it's a very strong community. But Claiborne in particular was the cultural mecca because people of color, Black people in particular, back in the early part of the 20th century were not allowed to mix in places like Canal Street. So Claiborne became the place where they shopped.
Right. I mean, it was about 3 to 4 miles of almost predominantly Black-owned businesses, professionals, doctors' offices, restaurants, clubs, you know, as well as like supposedly one of the most beautiful, you've seen pictures of it, it's one of the most beautiful areas in the city, lined with live oaks.
And then of course in the 60s, you had the interstate come through and totally devastate the community. It devastated it economically, and it just began a downward spiral of disinvestment for Treme.
Most of what went on here was something that happened broadly in the United States. By the late 50s, with the federal highway system and other kinds of federal programs, there was a lot of money that was going into urban renewal and urban development. And so a lot of cities jumped on that. New Orleans did the same thing. And so they were proposing to build 2 different urban arterial highway areas, right? One that was going through basically Treme through the mid part of the city, and another one that was going to go through the French Quarter.
The myth in the city is that the Claiborne Expressway was built to replace the Riverfront Expressway because the citizens in the French Quarter were much more successful in getting the interstate removed from the riverfront, but that is not true. There are newspaper clippings from 1945 that actually show the Claiborne Expressway was the first piece of the interstate system to actually be planned for New Orleans. News of the Riverfront Expressway actually came in 1946. It was purposeful that the interstate was planned here. In the 60s, when they finally realized that this is going to happen and it's not going to be good, Black people in New Orleans did not have the political standing that was necessary to help them fight this. So we didn't have people in the city council, we didn't have a friend in the mayor, and you need those allies when you want to fight something like an urban highway. And truthfully, when you go back to a 1945 news clipping, you realize it was made 20 years before we actually saw the final product.
So it's not like somebody's going to say, oh, we put it here because it was a community of Black people. No, they're going to say that, you know, it was defeated because of these issues around preservation, so we decided to go here instead. It made more sense. But it destroyed like one of the most important Black urban districts in the United States.
Because people in New Orleans are resilient, they found ways to actually continue cultural traditions in spite of the interstate. And those go on today in terms of jazz funerals and parades and second lines. So the resilience of the people actually made them, in a way, overcome an obstacle, which is the interstate. But it did do a lot of devastation to the cultural richness, particularly in terms of the stores and the shopkeepers and the Black business owners. It really devastated that part of the community. Treme suffers from not having things like grocery stores. So services and conveniences are really the result of disinvestment, or I would say the lack of services and the lack of conveniences and the lack of a really good quality of life are all things that are a result of having to live in the Claiborne corridor that has been wrecked by a highway. So right now, the economic conditions in Treme are changing. There is a lot of development pressure.
And so that's the big thing, is urban redevelopment can help developers, landowners, government, but for renters and especially lower income, oftentimes communities of color, it often is not going to benefit them, right?
When property values shoot up because this becomes a better place. And that's typically what happens when urban highways are removed. The property values shoot up, and the people who struggled here and who've lived here either can't pay the taxes or can't pay the rent or whatever predicament they find themselves in. So we have to protect those people, people like me. If my taxes go up and I can't pay them, I'm going to have to sell my home. And my family's been here for 70 years. So as we move forward and look at redevelopment in the corridor, we do have to make sure that the people who contribute to the culture of Treme are protected and are able to stay here. So we have to build equity. We have to work on that piece. Otherwise, we'll just fail. Actually, the city proposed a few years ago to build a marketplace under the Interstate. And several residents and business owners and property owners opposed the plan for a lot of reasons. We didn't think it was economically viable. It floods, it rains through the interstate, and it's toxic under there. This is not something that had community support, and it does not have strong support, truthfully. We would prefer to see more traditional development on vacant parcels in Treme. That makes sense, and it also makes sense to support business owners that have been here and who've struggled when the city, neither the city nor the state nor the federal government have put any money into the corridor. So our position was celebrate the people who have struggled. Now we're in a position where we have to decide, do we want to maintain a piece of infrastructure that is detrimental to our community from a public health standpoint and from an economic standpoint, or do we want to remove it, do great placemaking that is inclusive? But when I look forward to a new Claiborne, I see a beautiful, prosperous, vibrant place, and I'm willing to work to get that. Hopefully my speaking out and trying to give people an accurate account of what happened, the good, the bad, and the ugly, will help us move forward with very clear eyes so that we can actually make the right decisions. Because the power is in the people's hands. The people just haven't realized it yet. But we hold all the cards. And the minute you think you don't hold the cards, you've lost the game. I don't intend to lose the game. It's not in the picture.